Hello and welcome to this discussion about cultural value. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Geoffrey Crossick and Dr. Patrycja Kaszynska to this conversation, really because I think we can assume that they are responsible in many ways for the start of the Centre for Cultural Value. And I wanted to talk to them both today about the work they did leading the Cultural Value Project, a massive undertaking, which incidentally you can find out all about in a delightful 204-page report. And we're going to ask them to do the almost impossible today to condense some of their thinking into this rather short interview to help us launch and think about the future of the Centre for Cultural Value. So without more ado, I'm going to jump into some of the kind of knotty big questions that we've thrown at them. So firstly, in the Cultural Value Project, you very clearly set out to get beyond some of the kind of quite crude debates about, you know, the sort of the difference between the intrinsic and instrumental value of culture, elite versus popular culture, participatory versus and so on, to come up with something a much more sophisticated, if you like, and meaningful, I suppose, and layered understanding of cultural value. And I suppose that we'd really like to hear from you, and I know this is a difficult thing to do, we'd really like to hear, just by way of introduction, how you describe the key findings of the Cultural Value Project.
Well, let me start on that one, and forgive me if I take more than a few sentences to say it, but I'll try and be brief. I think the starting point has to be that this was a project set up by a research council, and therefore critical research perspectives were the driver behind it. This was not an advocacy report. Indeed, when I was asked to take it on, would I direct it? I said, this is not for advocacy, is it? This is going to be a serious research project. And the aim of it was not to find new evidence for the value of arts and culture, though we did find some quite important new evidence in precise areas. But rather what we really wanted to do was to reconfigure the way we have the conversations about this, to make them more honest, more constructive, and as I said from the beginning, more grown up, where we were willing to accept that culture didn't do wonderful things all the time for everything, which was how that argument had gone before. We explore a huge range of themes and evidence, and thank you, Anne, for mentioning the fact that there's a 204-page report. I can add there's about a 12-page executive summary for those who wish to have a taster first. But when I started getting asked to speak all around the world about this, and I was surprised at how much interest there was around the world, to people who are not primarily interested in our introspective UK debates, I decided I had to find a new way of presenting it. And what I did was I raised 4 questions, each of which I then answered, about the questions that need to be asked if we're going to understand the value of arts and culture. And I think they're the best way to summarize the findings of the project. So let me just very quickly present those 4 questions. The first fundamental one, which always made people sit up and smile as if they hadn't thought of this before, is about cultural value, the value of arts and cultures. Who wants to know, and why do they want to know? And that seemed to be really important, because is it just advocacy for public funding? Is it accountability to boards of cultural institutions? Is it academics wanting to build research knowledge? Is it for arts organisations and practitioners themselves to improve their own practice? All of those seem to me to be important, but the way in which advocacy dominates has skewed what is done everywhere, I think, and particularly in this country. It's what we think governments want to hear that dominates, and it's not even necessarily what governments do want to hear. That's the first question. The second question that we tried to be different on is to ask, what is the phenomenon whose value we're trying to understand? What's the phenomenon whose value we're trying to understand? We tend always in these debates to focus on publicly funded arts and culture, and it's the advocacy driver that makes publicly funded arts and culture dominate. But most arts and culture, the vast majority of arts and cultural experience that people have, is not publicly funded. And so we emphasize the importance of commercial provision and of amateur practice. And we also emphasize the importance of consumption at home and consumption and engagement digitally, both of which are neglected in value research. The third question that I ask when I present it internationally is, are we looking in the right places when we look for value? We have chapters on 2 neglected areas that we think are really important and are rarely part of the discussion. A chapter on the reflective individual and a chapter on the engaged citizen. And we ask how arts and cultural experience can be seen to support those. And it's not unproblematic, but it's really important. But even in more conventional areas, we ask whether we're looking in the right places. So on the economy, when the cultural sector pours out economic impact studies, we are very doubtful about the value and indeed the rigor of economic impact measures. We direct attention to other issues on the economy, like an imaginative and innovative society, or the ecology that the creative industries were a part of. And so we say, let's look elsewhere. Or on cities, there's a lot of emphasis on urban regeneration, but that ignores the disruption of the communities where that regeneration takes place. And instead we point towards the way in which everyday arts and culture has been seen to stabilize and support regeneration in poorer communities, and do that in a way that is much more organic and developmental. The final question is, how do we know? By what methods do we know the value of arts and culture? And here our big argument in what is a long, and I hope people will find fruitful chapter, we stress the need to get away from the notion of a hierarchy of methods, where randomized control trials, scientific experiments, and quantification sit well above the qualitative approaches and qualitative methods. And our argument is that there's no hierarchy. The issue is the methods that are best for what we're trying to find out. And that often means, are we trying to find breadth of data or depth of understanding? And both are important. So, as I said at the beginning, I hope people will read the report and find out more about what we're saying. But that's the way I like to summarize what we're doing. I don't know whether, Patrycja, you want to add anything to that?
Well, that's a pretty good summary of the 200 plus pages. I think that it is difficult to talk about findings if those are to be expressed in bullet points. My understanding of what we're doing is that we were reframing and redirecting the debate, right? And reframing in the sense of departing from the arguments over the allocation of public funding, and redirecting in the sense of not starting with the auxiliary effects like economic, social, and so forth, but yes, indeed, with culture as experienced. And it was a sort of provocation and a way of steering the debate onto a different territory and away from being conceived in terms dictated by policy making, right? Yeah, on the whole, I think where we got to is trying to reconfigure the field of inquiry, practice, if you like. For me, I think the most interesting takeaway point was that cultural value, understanding it, is not so much about the evidence-based base as about how understanding is produced. So, yeah.
My next question to you, really, which was about your recommendations for the centre. So, in fact, one of the big "what happens next" recommendations from your work on the cultural value was that there should be a kind of cultural value observatory created, and of course that is now what we are. This discussion, in a way, is all around the launch of. So yes, I just wanted to ask you, what were the questions that you felt that a dedicated national research centre should be addressing?
Can I give a general answer to that and then pass to Patrycja, because she did the work on the scoping project, in a sense was the bridge between the report and the centre. The reason why we didn't have any, as people who read the report will find, there are no recommendations apart from one at the end. What there are a lot of points that we've highlighted for consideration, but the only recommendation is the setting up of what we called an observatory. It turned out not to be a name that was attractive, and so a centre was what it was called. And the reason why we thought it would be a good idea, and I talked to the AHRC about it to make sure that there's no point in putting that recommendation if they weren't interested, but they were very interested. But we emphasise one thing, which was it should be with partners. This should not just be another. This was a Research Council initiative. Now a Research Council had to find partners who wanted a centre, and they did. two very major partners in Arts Council England and the Paul Hamlin Foundation. But the reason why we thought it was worth proposing that as our sole recommendation was actually to keep the momentum going of the kind of work that the Cultural Value Project was doing. Reports appear and reports go, and some have some impact and some have none. But at a certain point, what they've been trying to do often just falls into the background. And what we felt was that it was important to have some institutional frame, not to agree with our findings as it went forward. It could disagree as it wanted to, but to maintain the critical stance, the highlighting of new areas and approaches, the emphasis on evaluation and methods, that some of those things it would keep going, because otherwise there would not be, the momentum would be lost. And a fundamental part of that, and the reason why it's so good that the three partners have come together in this to support this centre, is to bring together practitioners, academic researchers, and policymakers. Our great feeling in the work on the report, as we scanned what was going on, was that these three kept apart, and they didn't really talk to each other very much. And that was for the great detriment of the kind of understanding and the practical value of the sorts of things we were talking about.
Oh yeah, that's really interesting. I think as a team, we have, over the time of the scoping and the sort of consultative work we've done this year, I think very much come to the conclusion that the serving of these three constituencies, but also bringing them together around debates, is absolutely at the heart of what we're doing. So that's very encouraging to hear you say that. And Patrycja, indeed, you did do the scoping project. And I'm wondering, after doing that really deep dive piece of work, I'm wondering, what was your thinking about the potential for a national research centre?
Well, what the cultural value scoping project really uncovered was the fundamental need for co-production. And what I mean by it is bringing together the different constituencies that come to interact when it comes to cultural value, right? The one sentence conclusion from the scoping project was the biggest, most pressing challenge is to create communities of understanding and practice for people across the sector, the arts and culture, funders, and the voluntary sector, academia and policy, right? That's a challenge, and yet probably the only viable way of advancing the conversations. These days, I would call it co-production. Back then, it was the framing of the terms of the debate. And in terms of how what you are doing relates and carries forward this idea, I think so far it is quite, it has been quite impressive how you do not resort to your existing contact lists and are willing to reach further afield to widen the scope of the debate.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've noticed already this, I think we have been as surprised as you were by how much appetite and interest there's been in this, in the subject. And I think it is also that, I like the idea of that centre, but almost like acting like a magnet for those, with an open invitation for those different constituencies to gather around. And it is certainly starting to have that effect, which is really interesting. I'm aware of the fact that we're kind of we've asked quite a lot of questions, but I've still got a couple of things I really wanted to ask you. One was particularly about the role of research. I noticed, Geoffrey, you used that word that you were, in a way, in your work, you were railing against the sort of the hierarchy of research methods, which I think is really interesting. In our original question, we were asking, whether you think that an awful lot of research in this field is a help or a hindrance. I think what I was really trying to get to is this. The split that you pointed out before, where research which is very, very pointedly about advocacy and advocacy only can get in the way of true understanding. So I was just wondering whether you could just really briefly outline for us your concerns around the ways in which some methodologies are valued over others, and how we can get away from that, really, I think.
Yeah.
So tell us a bit more about the hierarchy of research and what we can do about it.
It's a big challenge, this. I mean, one of the interesting things that I learned when talking in larger groups, not just to arts and humanities people, about the hierarchy of methods. And I referred to randomized control trials being the treated as if they're the gold standard, when actually there are very few situations where you can use RCTs. And then researchers on, and I refer to drug trials as being the best, the obvious one. And then people in that area of science said, actually, they don't even work that well in drug trials. You know, that even the RCTs become the gold standard. And I think one of the problems I have with the way in which these are now being discussed is that gold standard has affected the what works centers and the way they approach evidence. And I think the issue for me, and I think for us in the report, is that if you have a hierarchy of methods, if you believe that causation is what you are trying to establish, then all those areas where it is very hard to understand what is happening without where you can't establish causation, because the variables are too complex. You can't isolate them to get a causal rate. And then that suddenly becomes of secondary importance, and secondary value, when actually some of the things we most want to understand in our lives, not just about art and culture, but many other things, are never susceptible to the stabilizing of all the variables and then doing an RCT or even an experiment. And that's what we wanted to emphasize. Not that we didn't think that RCTs or experiments or quantitative evidence shouldn't be used where that was the right way to find answers. But there were whole areas which could, of the way in which people experienced art and culture and what difference it made to them and their communities and their lives, that could not be captured in those ways, and therefore were being lost to view because of approaches in policy making and therefore in those feeding into policy making, which said, unless it's the kind of tough data that we think is right, it's fluffy. And there are examples of research that we found, and research that we funded, actually. I mean, some extraordinary research that we funded, which used ethnographic and literary methods to understand what was happening, and did so very rigorously, and discovered things about what's happening in a dance group or a reading group that you would have never captured in any other way. And that's what we wanted to argue, was that with the range of methods needs to be used, the critical issue is they have to be the right methods for what it is you are trying to learn. And you could have various methods, you don't have just one, but the right method for what you're trying to learn, and whatever method you're using must be used rigorously. Qualitative research can be just as rigorous as quantitative, and qualitative research can be done just as badly, but so can be done badly, non-rigorously, and so can quantitative. It's rigorous, whatever the method is.
Again, I hope we're really living up to the legacy here. You know, we're working on there was quite a strong call, I think, from our consultees. You know, we were surprised by how many people really did want how to process-oriented advice. So we are working in the principles that you set down in your recommendations, not on any toolkits or how-tos, but on a set of principles that get people thinking about some of these issues. So I hope it's something that we're going to be able to deliver on. And on that note, I'm just going to come on to our last question really to you, which is, what is your greatest aspiration now for the centre? This is a piece of news and advice we'd really like to hear. What's your aspiration? You know, if we achieve one thing, Patrycja and Geoff, what would they be? What would it be?
Have courage to be at the center of the contested debates. So you could say grit in the eye, grain of sand in the oyster, without alienating, nonetheless not to resolve for an easy status quo. And yeah, good luck with that.
I was going to say, thanks. That's a gauntlet, Geoff.
It in part matches what Patrycja said, but I want it to be exciting. I want it to be inclusive of all the different communities we've talked about. But at the same and I want it to be useful to all those communities. And the reason for that is I want it to become indispensable. It has been funded for a time-limited period, and I hope the funders and others will take stock of how it's developing and decide what happens to it. I think it would be very sad if it had a short period of active life and then didn't continue. And therefore, I think it needs, and it's a really tough intellectual and social and political challenge, but it's got all its communities. It's got to get all its communities to feel, God, we need this to continue, because we don't like necessarily everything it does, and we don't agree with it all the time, but it's doing something that is useful, and that therefore we want it to continue. That's what I'd most like to happen.
They are fantastic challenges from both of you. Thank you so much indeed for all your input on that. And I think we're going to stop there. Thank you again.